Okay, good morning, Land and Investment Group. We're here today in November 2024, and we're going to go through, I'm going to present to you guys about the importance for real estate investors to know about asset protection. And I am an attorney with the Asset Protection and Elder Law Center. We're an estate planning law firm based out of Costa, Mesa. And I think that this topic is something that would be valuable to all of you guys, because most of you are in the sphere dealing with real estate investors and advising them regarding properties and things like that. And so if you can have that value add where you can provide additional knowledge to them and let them know about asset protection and how they can protect their assets, and be able to refer them to a law firm like ours for complex questions, it's only going to make you a better real estate advisor to your clients, because they feel like you have more resources and more knowledge and things like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. So an overview of kind of what I'm going to talk about is asset protection defined, and then asset preservation defined. So when we talk about asset protection, that's one thing, and asset preservation is another thing, right? So how are we protecting our assets, but how are we preserving our assets to be able to pass them on to the next generation, or with minimal tax liability and things like that. And then tips to limit investors' exposure, that's something else that we're going to talk about. So ways that investors can limit their exposure when they're investing in real estate. I know everybody wants to go out there and invest in real estate, whether it's commercial real estate, residential real estate, but they want to make sure that they don't have that exposure to liability. How are they going to limit their exposure to being sued? So I'm going to discuss that. And then about the importance of creating an entity. So that's a form of asset protection as well. Generally, the preferred entity is an LLC. That's the preferred method of holding property and things like that. So talking a little bit about why real estate investors should create an entity to hold their property, so they kind of have that separation between personal assets versus corporate assets. And then I'm going to touch a little bit on the Corporate Transparency Act. That's something that was new, that was passed, and it's something to just be aware of. It doesn't mean that you have to necessarily do it, but I think being aware of it and at least bringing it up to your clients that own LLCs, so that they can reach out to their CPA or attorney to make sure they're in compliance with that, so that they don't get any kind of fines or things like that for not being on top of that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, at the end, asset protection versus probate protection, because at the end of the day, real estate investors want to limit their exposure to liability, but like we all know, death and taxes are certain, right? So eventually when that real estate investor passes on, are they making sure that they have their assets protected from probate, so that they're not triggering that, and that they're not having leaving a mess for their heirs and their family and stuff to deal with? So that's a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to discuss today. So can you go back one? Sorry, okay. So thanks, Ben. Asset protection defined. So this is methods by which an investor can help protect property and assets from creditors. So the biggest reason that people do asset protection is to how to protect people from creditors, plaintiffs who win a judgment in a lawsuit. So the classic example is you have an investor that owns, say, a 5-unit apartment building, let's just say out in Long Beach, and they're renting it, and they have tenants living there, they're collecting an income, all that sort of stuff, right? And they buy this as, Mr. and Mrs. Smith decide to invest, and they want to go into the world of real estate investing, and you sell them this 5-unit building, and they're happy, and they've got tenants in there and all this sort of stuff. But what they don't realize is maybe one of those tenants slip and fall down the stairs, or they have a guest over and one of their guests slips or falls on the premises, or things like that, right? What's going to happen is they're going to say, well, now that I slipped and fell, I'm going to go and sue Mr. and Mrs. Smith, because the pavement was crooked, and because they didn't pave it properly, that's why I injured myself and I had to go to the hospital. So what's going to happen is the plaintiff is going to want to get a judgment against Mr. and Mrs. Smith in a lawsuit. Now what happens is that 5-unit building that they own, let's just say it's $2 million, just for the sake of an easy number. If they get a judgment against them and say, I have pain and suffering, I have all these injuries, and they go to court, and the judge and the jury say, yeah, that's the case. You know what, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, if you had fixed the pavement, they wouldn't have been injured, and now, you know, you're on the hook for $500,000. What's going to happen is they're going to turn around and want to execute that judgment on Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and so they're going to put a lien on the property. They're going to find a way to try to collect from them. They might even go after them personally, right? So they're going to say, oh, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Smith has a property, they've got a rental, a vacation home, they've got assets, they've got money, and they're going to say, you know, we can definitely collect this $500,000. So now what happens is an investor that went into it kind of their first experience buying a, you know, multifamily property, they didn't realize that this could happen, and they should have thought about putting it in a LLC or an entity. So the asset protection structure is going to protect them from judgments in a lawsuit, plaintiffs, things like that. And certain types of properties have a higher risk of that, right? So generally, you know, where you have multifamily dwellings, there's a higher risk because people are living in the unit, things can happen. You know, the classic case is you have a swimming pool in the backyard and you're renting out your single family residence and their kid goes in the back and falls in the pool, right? Now they're suing the landlord and saying, well, you know what, you should have put a fence up, or, you know, this or that, or things like that. So it's important for investors to be aware of those risks when they go into purchasing property, because they might not know. They think, okay, I'm just looking at cap rate, I'm just looking at purchasing a property, and I'm thinking it's, you know, I can make some good investment and I can get some good cash flow on the side. But there's a lot of liability that they're entering into. So asset protection is something that lets them realize there are ways to limit that type of liability. So that's what asset protection is.
You're talking about exposure.
Their exposure, right? And we're going to talk of ways to limit their exposure. So asset preservation is something else too. So there's kind of two considerations, right? Mr. and Mrs. Smith want to protect themselves from those lawsuits, but they also want to preserve those assets, right? Because they've gone out there and purchased that property, and they're thinking one day we can pass it on to our children, or we can pass it on to our, you know, brothers and sisters, the family. We're buying it to increase the wealth of the family. So they want to preserve that asset. So this is ways by which an investor can minimize your taxes and preserve the assets so that they can be passed on. So they need to also know how to adequately do this, right? So if they're able to pass that property on, their heirs would be able to get a step up in tax and start to step up in their basis of tax. So stuff like that. There are other ways too that they can preserve those assets by being able to make sure they have it in certain entities, or to make sure that they're passing it on to their children adequately and minimizing the tax liability. Some of this stuff is also like Prop 19 issues with asset preservation, you know, ways that you could pass on those rental properties or pass on that money to your children without incurring any kind of tax or minimal taxation. So that's a bit about asset preservation. So those are the two concerns that a lot of investors have. So these are some tips to limit the investor's exposure. So when you have a real estate investor that's going out and buying that 5-unit building, or buying that retail strip center, or buying the office building, or things like that, or even the single family residence, the number one thing that they can do is make sure that they have a comprehensive umbrella insurance policy. That's an easy in. And a big thing people don't think of is you should increase your coverage as your portfolio increases, right? So right now we're in a time of appreciation. So maybe they purchased that, you know, that property for $500,000, but now it's worth $2 million. That's great that they've gotten all of that equity, but their coverage should also adequately reflect that, because if there's a loss to that property and they're only insuring at the $500,000 level, there's going to be a gap in that, right? And that can be a problem if you're renting it out to a tenant or things like that, because it can affect some of that income if you're not able to recoup that, right? So it's important to make sure that investors always have a good umbrella policy and they reach out. And it's also good because it protects them, you know, so if there's any kind of gap in the homeowner's policy or coverage like that, they're reaching out to the umbrella policy to recover, right? So again, if someone slips and falls, they're no longer reaching out to Mr. and Mrs. Smith, they're tendering the claim to the umbrella insurance policy, right? So if you have a $5 million policy, and it's actually not that costly for a lot of these policies, you know, people think, oh, $5 million worth of coverage, that's not what you're paying out of pocket. You know, if you shop it and you talk with people, you can find a good, really comprehensive policy that would protect you from that kind of lawsuit and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
However, with the recent happenings, insurance has gone sky high. For example, at my shopping center, they've never before asked to see copies of each tenant's
Right.
renter's
Oh.
insurance. I had to produce copies of each, and they had to be, with, additional insured, Sons of Francis E. Elliott LLC, and they had to be for at least $1 million. And they're asking the same thing for my Barstow storage facility, and I can't get the renters to get insurance because they're paying $300 a month for a storage facility, and they're saying, why do I wanna pay $1,800 a year for insurance? That's doubling my costs.
Right, but again, that's just like right now with inflation, right? Everything else is, if in a way, if you're not turning around and making sure that your tenants have that, they don't have that renter's insurance, it's the liability is going to fall back on you as a real estate investor. So unfortunately, maybe we've done things differently in the past, or practices have been done, but it's a good time to shore up those business practices now, just because insurance is denying the claims. Things are costing more. Properties, just as our property values increase to $2 and $3 million, the replacement cost is more, right? Wood, labor, those types of things. So the insurance is just making sure that they're covering on that, right? To rebuild the same house that you built in the 70s is going to be a lot more today, right? And we can't fight that, or we can't get ahead of that. But the insurance is making sure that they're covering it. So when you have like under market, tenants that have been getting the lower rent, I understand you get the pushback, but the problem is then the landlord is left on the hook for that gap, right? So it's a matter of, and sometimes, it's a practical issue. It might be a matter of, well, this is just how we're doing business now. And I know if you don't like the $300, I know I could rent it for $1,000 and someone would still be lining up. Unfortunately, I know, and I know sometimes as investors, we have relationships with our, people who've been there 20 years, and we don't want to have it happen like that. But these are all like business decisions at a certain point, just like the insurance is raising it as a business decision because they can't afford to cover it. Sometimes, and those are conversations to have with real estate investors, where sometimes they might not want to consider these things, because they say, yeah, well, now I have to have the additional insured as the landlord. But those are good things to review leases, review a lot of that stuff, and maybe it's a good time to get that stuff cleaned up because I've even seen umbrella insurance, a lot of them on multifamily, they say unless you have stuff repiped, if it's older properties, they're not even touching it unless the landlord goes through and does a lot of maintenance on it. So it's unfortunate, but you have to look at from the perspective of the insurance. They know if it's pipes that have already been there for 40 years, it's a matter of time. If they take that on, they're going to have to pay the claim. So some of that is just deferred maintenance, right? And the idea is that investors should be setting aside, this is more setting aside money in their reserves so that they have those money to make those, repairs periodically, right? Technically, like a reserve study and that sort of stuff. But I understand the frustration because a lot of people do feel that. But that's I would say the biggest thing, because now if you have a client or a tenant that slips and falls and they're turning around and suing you, and you don't have that umbrella policy because they didn't want to present proof of renter's insurance, it's just going to hurt the landlord in the long run. So that's the hard part. It's kind of like you're between a rock and a hard place. But I would really recommend, even if it's expensive, it's worth it to carry it just to protect yourself from lawsuits. Especially, unfortunately, we're in a society of people are very litigious, right? And I hate to say it, when economy is also really tight, you're going to get more people that are going to go that route of trying to look into the deep pockets and suing people. So it's important to kind of be ahead of the game on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, we have an umbrella, and I have to check with the insurance agent. I think it covers the storage building. But when Jerry Cleveland did the inspection, he found out that it's wired with aluminum wiring. And so is the insurance company going to come back and say you have to rewire the whole industrial storage building?
It's a possibility, yeah. So
yeah, it's just,
start setting aside.
It just opens up a whole can of
pennies
worms.
for that, for the
We
inevitable.
keep sending out every year a notice on their rent statement that the landlord's insurance only covers building and exterior. We don't cover what's inside your unit. So if you want to protect what's inside your unit, you need to get your own tenant's insurance policy, and they don't want it because it's too expensive.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Am I gonna start forcing tenants out because I have to insist that now the one suggestion the insurance company came up with was if they have homeowners insurance on their house, see if the homeowners insurance will cover the unit as well.
That's true.
And it's gonna be a real battle.
It's contents,
Contents policy
Yeah.
for personal possessions that the
that you have on your home. I have it on my homeowner, but it also covers all my tools and stuff.
Right.
So the truck gets wiped out, auto insurance takes care of that, but my personal possessions in there are under my homeowner's insurance. So.
You can't rent an apartment without getting renter's
Right,
insurance.
that's
Right.
a storage unit, they're not,
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah.
But if you're renting an apartment, I would think your renter's insurance, you could add something to cover the storage, instead of a separate rental.
Yeah.
Yeah, with
It's gonna be a real battle.
renting an
Yeah.
apartment, you can require that they have it when they sign the initial lease, but you are not allowed to terminate them if they don't continue to renew or they just cancel it.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not a cause for eviction.
It's not a just cause.
Not
Well,
just cause, yeah.
then raise your rate and get the insurance for them,
Right, yeah.
you know? I mean, 300
What's
is
gonna happen
not
when you
bad.
raise your rate, they're gonna start leaving.
Yeah.
There's other people that will fill it.
And
The ones that
Yeah.
leave are the ones
If
that
you, if you have
that
a
are-
waiting list of people wanting to rent there, you wouldn't have, you don't have a problem.
Yes, correct.
If, so on one of these, situation in a home that's being rented, and the tenant, or child slips and falls, it gets injured.
Right.
They don't sue against that property, they sue on everything that the
Well,
owner has?
well, that's why, if you have asset, so that's what we're saying with asset protection, if you have an LLC, and that's like you have a property, 123 Main Street, and you put it into the 123 Main Street LLC, they can only sue on that property because that's where their injury happened. So they're not suing Mr. and Mrs. Smith for all their assets. So that's exactly kind of part of the point of why we're saying that you need to have an entity or asset protection to protect you, because a lot of investors just kind of get into it, and you have to be careful too, because a lot of people kind of are like, they have a $2 million asset, but they might be like, oh, well, we don't want to insure it, or we don't want to pay for, getting an LLC. But it's like, you have to look at the big picture, right? Because if you get sued on it, the money that they're coming after is a lot more than what it's going to cost for you to do the LLC. So a lot of it is that education piece and letting tenants or clients know about that stuff.
I've seen lawsuits where they sue the company, the owner, the private
Right.
owner, the gardener, and those 1 through 50. I mean, you could be sued.
Right.
But it's protecting.
You want-
Right.
If
And
there's a judgment, they can't.
You want
Right.
layers of protection.
And the thing is, I'll talk about it in here too, when we talk about LLC entities a little bit, it's about like the corporate veil too. So a lot of it is, you have to be careful, because when you do have an LLC or an entity and you have your personal stuff, you want to keep it real separate, right? So the LLC should have its own bank accounts. It should be running everything through the LLC. A lot of times when they name everybody in a lawsuit, they're trying to see if they can poke at that and say, oh, well, I know you went out to lunch and you put it on the LLC tab, or you took a personal plane trip. Then they can say, you're not really using it as a corporate entity. You're just kind of using it like a loosey-goosey type thing. So that's also part of it, is creating the entity, but then part of it is having that discipline to really stick to it. If you get the rent money, you're putting the rent money in there, you're paying the property tax out of there, you're paying repairs out of there. You're not, taking, oh, there's a profit. I mean,
And everything.
right. You don't want to commingle it, right? And that's when you get into the risk of them coming after people and suing them personally and saying, hey, this is just a sham, it's a shell. You're just creating an LLC, but there's really no corporate entity. It's you just running it as your own business. So,
Get yourself a good bookkeeper, my bookkeeper doesn't let me get away with anything.
right, yeah, and that's
Right.
key. That's key. I would say, with this, it's really about having like your A team around you. Like you want to surround yourself with a good team, have a good attorney, have a good CPA, have a good bookkeeper, a good real estate advisor. Somebody that knows the real estate stuff, and then even a good financial advisor, so that you kind of have your team assembled and they can make sure you're steering the boat and it's going where you want it to go. So it's not like one thing's doing one thing over here and there. So.
A good tax preparer.
Right. So I would say the whole thing. So yeah, so the insurance policy, then we were talking about the limited liability to create that separation. We talked a little bit about that. Another thing you want to do is limit the risk. So a lot of times you screen those tenants, speak with references, right? You want to make sure, who are you letting come into your, place and rent it? Work with contractors who carry proof of insurance. That's another huge thing. So many times people are like, oh, I just have a handyman or a contractor, and they don't carry their own insurance. Now you have exposure, right? Because now they slip and fall, and now they're suing you. Whereas if they were an HVAC guy that had their own bonded license type of situation, they're protecting their workers on it. So it's really about limiting your risk with respect to things like that as well.
I can't tell you how many times I've gotten out of my car and somebody's come up to me and says, can I trim your tree for you? And I say, yeah, do you have insurance? No. I said, no, you can't.
Yeah, see, so yeah, it's
I
well
wanna see a
worth it.
license, I wanna see workers' comp insurance, I wanna see a bond.
It's, yeah, it's so
I mean,
important.
It's gotten to the point where,
That's true, yeah. And then the other thing that people do is to, and this is for more savvy investors or people that are kind of worried about a lot of exposure, is you could create a holding company. So the Wyoming LLC structure in and of itself is a very strong LLC. There's no state income tax on the LLC. You have a lot of privacy. It keeps members' information confidential. So a lot of people like the Wyoming LLC structure. So what you can do is create like an LLC, like, you know, California LLC, and then have it housed under your Wyoming LLC. You know, again, a lot of this stuff, it depends how much liability and exposure you have, right? So if you own multiple, you know, apartment buildings, maybe you have more exposure, right? Maybe you only have one single family home as a real estate investor. You have to gauge that exposure and kind of see based on all these things. Do you think you have tenants that are litigious? Do you feel like your property is older and it's more, the chances of people slipping and falling or more injuries occurring or more? You know, if you have a retail strip center, that's a huge one, right? You have people coming in and out to the restaurant, they're coming into the Albertsons grocery center. You know, there's a lot more chance of something happening. You know, people are parking in the shopping center, you know, maybe there's a shooting in the shopping center. A lot more things can happen. So in those cases, it may be advantageous to have the Wyoming LLC. And it's because the charging orders too, they prevent creditors from seizing assets of the LLC. So in the state of Wyoming, they don't enforce the charging orders.
What are charging orders?
Oh, charging order is basically like once you get a judgment. And so it's a judgment that you get. And so you say, I can go after the entity. They don't enforce it in Wyoming. So they are a lot more lax about it. That's why everybody has the business in Wyoming and the Wyoming LLC. So they won't enforce the judgment against it. So you get a lot more, you know, a lot more protection by having the structure. But this structure again is more, it's a lot more work to maintain. It's more costly. So it has to make sense for your real estate investor. But there are these options, you know, depending on what kind of investors you have in their exposure. So a little bit about creating the entity. We talked a little bit about it. The limited liability company is the preferred method for holding property. So when you have real estate investors, they may say, well, why can't I have an S Corp or a C Corp? Corporations have a lot more record keeping. You have to have corporate minutes, things like that. So the LLC is kind of, it has the best of both worlds, but it allows you to have an operating agreement and you don't have to keep corporate minutes. So it is important to note that, you know, when people create an LLC, yeah, you could go on LegalZoom and do it and do it real quick. But if you don't have a real robust operating agreement and it doesn't list the duties of the members and things like that, it could be later on challenged, or you could open yourself up to litigation in the future. So you want to make sure that you really have a professional draft the LLC that protects you the most regarding, you know, what you're trying to do with it. There's different types of tax statuses, so you would want to talk with your tax preparer as well as to how do you want the LLC to get taxed, as a disregarded entity, S or C Corp, or a partnership, right? Your CPA would be able to better advise you regarding that. That's what I was saying. It's important to have yourself surrounded by that team where you have the attorney helping create it, you have your real estate advisor helping you, and then you have a CPA looking overall at your taxes and saying, okay, this would be the best situation for you. It separates your,
What's a disregarded entity?
a disregarded, I don't know, would you be able to speak more?
Basically for, Joan's gonna, but anyway, for tax purposes, let's say you, Kathy, own an entity like a LLC or corporation or whatever. For the purposes of figuring out what with taxes, you kind of ignore or disregard the entity, and so it's basically like pass-through taxation. There's no extra fees, expenses, etc. involved in that process, so you effectively disregard it. Oops. Dragging a bag.
Yeah.
So does that answer your question, Kathy?
Yeah.
So yeah, so that, so it,
I'm sorry.
are you okay?
nature calls.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
That's okay, we'll just cut from the video and then we'll restart the virtues of editing.
So the separating personal assets, corporate assets, we discussed a little bit as well, right? You wanna keep your assets separate, otherwise it's gonna trigger that corporate veil where you pierce the corporate veil. So you don't wanna use your entities as your own assets, right? So you don't wanna be using the corporate credit card or the LLC bit, card to take yourself out to eat and stuff like that. You just wanna keep it separate. Protection from potential lawsuits as well. So if you have an LLC, it can be a powerful tool for investors. A lot of times people will look up ownership, right? Like we all, look up, okay, who owns title on this property, owns title on that. So a lot of times if someone's looking, and they say, wow, that person has their property in an LLC, they know, okay, that's probably a savvy investor, or that property is managed, it's being managed. And so the chances of, I'm not saying the chances of lawsuit are less, but I think, when you have litigious individuals and you see stuff, oh, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, they know that they don't have that asset protection in place. So it's important to also have that, because it creates the air where a lot of protects you from potential lawsuits, because people kind of feel like you have that entity in place. The California fees for LLCs are $800 a year, so that's something to keep in mind. So another question that sometimes I get is, okay, I have, like 10 different investment properties, for example, right? So say somebody owns a couple of multifamily units and they've got an office building and some stuff. Do they throw all of it into one LLC? I would say it's really a cost benefit analysis. You want to look at how much risk each property derives. So, if you have real estate investors and they have a large portfolio, you don't want to stick all $20 million worth of their portfolio into one LLC, because now you're not limiting their risk, right? If someone slips on one property, they're tying all the others into it. So it's important to kind of look and assess the risk and see if it's worthwhile. I mean, it might not be worthwhile to have 20 different LLCs, but you would have to see, because again, you have the LLC fee, and then as well as you have tax fees to file taxes every year on them. So it has to make sense. But it's something to consider, that if they have, it's not just you put everything in one LLC. It is generally to protect them from risk of lawsuit and that sort of stuff. So you don't want to increase the amount of assets that they have in one entity, because then it would increase their risk of, if they get sued, all those properties are being tied into it. So that's something else to think
You
about.
also have the Texas Series LLC. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that also opens up another can of worms.
I mean, those are all, there's more complex, just like the Wyoming LLC and the series, there's a lot of different ways. And again, that's why it's really important, I would say, with stuff like that, when you have clients or investors, to really reach out to professionals to discuss those things, as opposed to going online and figuring it out, because there might be something that really fits their situation really well. And unless they're talking to professionals, they wouldn't know that, right? It's kind of not a do-it-yourself type of thing. You want to make sure, you're making the best financial decisions. The Corporate Transparency Act. So this is a new federal law where, when we have LLCs, a lot of times people don't know who the true owner of that entity is. But now they want privately held companies to identify who the owners are. And a lot of it is to combat money laundering, tax fraud, corrupt activities, because a lot of times people create these LLCs to evade taxes. So now corporate entities have to report by January 2025 if you're an existing LLC. If you're a new LLC that gets formed, you have to report immediately. And so this is the website, so if anyone wants more information on it. And that's something to know too, because if you have investors that have LLCs, it's important to at least make them aware of the Corporate Transparency Act. Hopefully their CPA or their tax professional or attorneys have already done that, because we've been doing a lot of stuff with our clients who have LLCs and helping them report, so that it's, they have all that stuff taken care of. Because I do believe there's some kind of fines or penalties that are in place if you don't report.
Yes, they're,
$500 a day.
yep.
Yeah.
I was gonna say they're very serious.
But
Yeah.
isn't it not just for LLCs, but
It's
for
for
all?
All
Yes.
entities, yes, all corporate entities. So it's and that's it's a newer law. So a lot of people, and January 2025 is not that far, So it's something that people should
If
make
you
sure.
haven't done it already,
Yes.
you're approaching too late.
So
But there are, in that new Corporate Transparency Act, there are some exceptions in there that,
Churches.
you have to make sure if you don't do it, you make sure you fit those exceptions.
right, I think the next slide, you want to go? I try to get a thing. Okay, so this is a bit of a flow chart that we have.
Okay.
So what was the entity formed under? If it's a U.S. law, is it a corporation? then you may have to report, is it an LLC? Then no. Was the company created by filing? It was a not. So you have to kind of go through it and see if this fits. But most companies, they're corporations or LLCs, they do have to file. It's kind of, if you know you're a foreign company, you might be subject to different reporting requirements, and that's why I linked that website to the BOI website, so that way you can go in there and read the language more if you know people that need to report or haven't. So that's important when you do. The thing is, you know, nowadays when you do have these LLCs or corporations, it's not just, oh, I have it. It's also making sure that you're in compliance with the requirements so that you're not getting fined heavily. So it's important that investors know that. And then, okay, so asset protection. So now that we've talked about ways that you can have asset protection, just an overview. Again, it's not everything, but it's an idea of it. But it's not probate protection, so I talked about that a little bit. So you place your investment property in an LLC, but it does not protect an investor from probate, right? So what is probate, right? Probate is distributing a decedent's assets according to state law, right? So Mr. and Mrs. Smith live a long, healthy life, and they've done everything and put their properties into LLCs. They've minimized their, tax liability by putting them into an LLC. They're doing asset preservation, but as part of that asset preservation, they need to make sure that they have a trust in place so that they avoid probate. Otherwise, their children are going to have to go through probate because the LLC alone does not protect you from estate, from the probate process. And this is an example. I just give this as an example because people don't really realize how expensive the probate court can be. So on $1 million property based on the fair market value at the date of death, which could be very possible, anybody's property could be worth $1 million in California easily, saying a house. For the probate court, $31,000 goes to the probate attorney and $31,000 goes to the personal representative of the estate, just on that one property. So a total of $62,000 is paid out of the estate, and there's a $3,500 filing fee just to open it. So right off the bat, on that one property not being in probate, the family's already shedding, $65,000 on that, right? And so imagine the cost that it would be for an investor. If you have investors that have $2, $3, $4 million properties and they're doing their LLC, but they're not doing the probate bit of it and they're not getting the stuff in order. Imagine how much money they're gonna have to pay out, right? When it could have just been solved by having an estate plan in place. So that's important too, because real estate investors wanna make sure that they're passing on what they work hard for, right? And they've accumulated this stuff, they wanna make sure they're properly protecting it.
These are based off of your assets, not net worth. So if you have $100,000 in equity in your $1 million
Right.
property, it's gone.
Right. No, and it's also just to know $1 million property, so it doesn't matter if you have a $900,000 note on it. It's based on the fair market value. So they don't care whether you have equity in it, whether it's owned free and clear. It's just the time of the fair market value, and it is a sliding scale. So it's not, like if I have 5 million, it's not necessarily 30, 30, 30, but it's just an illustration of how much you would be spending. So. So the importance of having a revocable living trust, that's going to protect you from going through probate. So you have so the way that we recommend you do it is you get your LLCs in order, and then you place the shares of the LLC into the revocable living trust. So that way you have your asset protection in place and you have your probate protection in place. And so it allows them to pass on their wishes, right? So you could have a power of attorney, you could have your healthcare directives, your will, you assign the assets into the trust. And a big part of having a revocable living trust, which a lot of investors like to know, is it's creditor protection for your heirs. So it protects your heirs from lawsuits. It does not protect you. So if I were to put all my property into a trust, I had an LLC and put it in a trust, the LLC now protects me from lawsuits provided I'm using it properly. But if I put it into the trust without an LLC, it does not give me creditor protection. But my children would get creditor protection because it's not the trust that they created, it's the trust that I created. So there is some value to that, right? Because sometimes you have investors who are concerned about, my children have a spending, habit, or they've got creditors that are coming after them. They ran up the credit card debt. Are they going to come after what's in their trust? And it's protected, so they get that creditor protection by having a trust in place for your children. I don't know if this video will play. I don't think so. I attempted to put a video in there. I was trying to be, but if not, that's okay.
Maybe not.
Okay, and then I think almost done. And then final tips and takeaways. So real estate investors should hold their properties in an LLC to protect themselves from personal liability. That's a non-negotiable. It's just really worth it if you're working with real estate investors.
You have to have a separate LLC for each property.
Oh, so I touched on that initially a little bit. I said, so for example, it's really a cost benefit analysis, because if you've got like, 10 fourplex units and you've got some retail and an office center, you don't want to stick it all in one LLC, because you're increasing your liability now, right? If one tenant falls there, now they're having access to all your properties. So it's really looking at which properties have a higher risk of lawsuit or litigation and having a separate LLC. I wouldn't say you would need to have 20 separate LLCs, but you might want to see, and also looking at the umbrella policy on each one and seeing where do you see risk of litigation could come about. So you don't necessarily have to have all, but you also don't want to throw all of them into one LLC, because then you're exposing yourself and all those assets. So, and then the real estate investors, the other thing, just
Back on the LLC per property. Are the LLCs required to be created within the state the property's in? For instance, if the property's in California, it has to be a California LLC, or could it be a Delaware LLC?
Okay, you could create a Delaware LLC, but if you're generating income in the state of California and that property is here, you're gonna have to pay tax in California.
But if it's not generating any income, then it's just,
I mean, yeah, then if it's not really generating income, you might be able to put it in another state's LLC. But if the moment it generates income, you're having to file a tax return in California on it.
Yeah.
So even if you do the Wyoming LLC and your property's in California, you still have to pay California
Yeah.
taxes.
So
okay,
that,
if
yeah.
it's generating income.
If it's yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe if it's a vacant piece of property that's not, I mean, but you're still gonna have to pay property tax on it in the state of California, but,
Right, not avoiding property tax.
right.
The
Just
secretary,
considering the multiple levels of filing, and if there's undeveloped land being owned, and it's another LLC's created in a different state that I don't have state tax requirement, the $800 a year
Right,
privilege tax.
right, for
Franchise tax.
yeah, the franchise, yeah,
well,
that's,
yeah, and the way that you pay that though is by you record or register the Wyoming LLC in California as a foreign entity, right? So, but the Secretary of State says whether you're doing business or whether you're making money or not, you should still register as a foreign LLC.
right, I had talked about earlier like a holding company, and so I
Yeah.
don't know if like that part where it's like, what people will do is put an entity, a California LLC into a Wyoming LLC, so you could create a California LLC because you're operating in California, so you can't just get away from that. And you put the shares of that into the Wyoming LLC, but that's more for asset protection purposes. So the Wyoming LLC doesn't have any state income tax requirement because Wyoming is very business friendly. And so now you have greater protection, because I mentioned about the charging orders as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if you get a lawsuit, Wyoming is a lot less likely to enforce that. So it gives you a lot more protection in that sense. But again, it's going to be more costly, and if you have a vacant piece of land, you have to look at what's your exposure, what's the risk there.
Oh, there's always risk.
But you have to see, is it worth it, how much risk is it worth, like again, the cost benefit analysis. Is it that someone's going to trip and fall? Is somebody going to come out there and shoot somebody on, right? You have to kind of see, because a lot of this stuff, like when people say like the Wyoming LLC and that sort of stuff, to create these complex structures, and for them to work and to really be asset protection, they can be costly. So it has to make financial sense for a lot of people to do these things as well, right? I mean, you're not paying a state tax or a regular tax on keeping the Wyoming LLC active, but it's still setting up the entity and making sure that it works the way that it does takes a certain amount of work. So that's the catch, right? So you kind of have to, at the end of the day, what's the risk? So that's what I would say with any of it. And that's kind of the whole thing about putting all your properties into an LLC. Okay, if they're all just small undeveloped pieces of land that are maybe worth not too much, maybe there's not that much risk and you could stick them all in one. But again, if you have like, the multi-family building, that's a lot more risk. Or the retail strip center with like, Starbucks and the grocery store, there's a greater risk that people might be in there, slipping and falling and things like that. So, but yeah, you can definitely have the Wyoming structure, it's an option. And then, yeah, this is it, so this is just our team, a picture of us, and, so yeah, if you guys have any questions or anything like that, you can always reach out to our firm. We specialize in asset protection and estate planning and that sort of stuff. I'm on the end. This is Patrick Van Cow. He's the expert on asset protection. He was raised in Paris, in France, so he has a lot of offshore asset protection trusts that he does. He works a lot with Cook Islands, so that's his forte. Shoddy is the other partner of the firm, Shoddy Schaefer. They both went to law school together, so she started the firm. The firm's been around for 20 years. And then it's myself and Valerie, that's the other associate attorneys. And then these are our two paralegals that handle a lot of our matters. And then Jay and Carol are our office admin. So we're a small team, but we're...
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I know you didn't speak on irrevocable trust in your presentation, but do you have any thoughts or recommendations with respect to irrevocable trusts, specifically in corporate trustees?
Okay, irrevocable trusts are advanced tax planning mechanisms. So it's something that you have to see, in terms of irrevocable trusts came up a lot with Prop 19. So that's an area that we saw a lot of irrevocable trust. With an irrevocable trust, anytime you create it, you're giving up control. So real estate investors have to be willing to give up control, because it's not a revocable trust. It doesn't really, it just changes the title and puts something into a trust, but it's to protect probate. Other than that, you can always refinance it. You could do stuff with it. When you put something in an irrevocable trust, you really give up a lot of control. So you will have a trustee that's managing it. That's not you. So if you put something in an irrevocable trust, the ease of taking it out and putting it back in and selling it, you give up that control. So because for the IRS to really view it as a separate entity or a separate trust, they have to have that arm's length, so you can't really have your hands in it. So irrevocable trusts are something that people do. We see it come up, I will tell you. I see it in higher net worth, and this is something for real estate investors. So 2026, the law is supposed to sunset, but who knows now? But as we had been advising clients, I believe it was 12.8 or roughly something like that per person that you could pass. So if someone passes away, they can pass 12.8 tax-free. So if you have a couple, let's say roughly 25 million, right? Now, when you deal with real estate investors in California, their portfolio could very well be over 25 million, right? And so what happens in families and cases like that is they have their LLCs in place, they have their entities in place, they have their revocable living trust, but they can only pass that 25 million. So if they have a $40 million estate, that anything over that is going to get taxed, and it's at the federal estate tax level. There's no state estate tax as it stands today, but the federal estate tax. So the irrevocable trust is a way for us to move property out of their name and into a separate entity, and to reduce that tax burden. So it is something that can be valuable for high net worth real estate investors. And we have clients that we work with that have large portfolios, and through a lot of advanced tax planning and working with CPAs, financial advisors, we're able to move a lot of that out of their estate by putting it into these irrevocable trusts.
So do you have any recommendations for corporate trustees that you guys have worked with? I've been referred to.
We have like fiduciaries and people that we work with. So yeah, definitely we work with those types of people and stuff like that. But yeah, so I would say that the next level is your basic level of stuff is the basic investor that's just trying to get in and at least get the LLC and get their trust done. But then if they are a higher net worth individual, they really should discuss the advanced tax planning to avoid the estate tax burden that they could face.
Should they start with an attorney or a fiduciary or insurance?
I would say,
who do they start with?
so I would say they should come in and talk to an attorney, because the law really dictates it, right? So
Yeah.
if it's the 12.8 and we're looking at their properties, that's the first layer of defense. And like we said, I always like to get they need the base of the revocable living trust, then we build the structure on top of it. And so through that conversation, we'll usually loop in a CPA as well, because if people with that kind of net worth probably have a CPA, so we need to sit and talk with them as well, and then maybe a financial advisor if there's other plans as to, are they planning on keeping those assets? Are they planning on not? Like I said, the step up in basis, a lot of conversations are there because some people want to sell now and get out of it, but maybe they don't know the benefits that they're missing out on. So so it's a, like I said, you really need your team of advisors and professionals that know how to deal with that stuff. But the point of this is to say that, you know, you're out there in the field working with real estate investors every day, and just know that, you know, there's a team here that can assist with that. If clients have those sophisticated questions and more complex questions, at least being able to refer them to somebody that deals in that area is huge, to know that you have like a trusted referral partner. So that's it. Anything else?
So the US, generally, Americans are kind of do-it-yourselfers.
Right.
And I see a lot of people who make emotional decisions about real estate.
Right.
I don't wanna deal with all of that, right? If you've got someone that's high net worth, you probably don't see that as much, but you get the, you know, retirees
Right.
that
Right.
don't wanna deal with all of that anymore, so that's when you recommend the irrevocable trust, rather than just selling everything and paying the tax?
The irrevocable trust is really, the trigger is if you're over that 25 million, like I said, that's
Okay.
really, so it's that, or 12.8, and some change or whatever, but it's that. The other time that we saw the irrevocable trusts really come up was the Prop 19, because that was a huge time when real estate investors were trying to get ahead of that, right? Because the whole thing with Prop 19 as it stands today, I'll touch briefly on it because that's a whole presentation in and of itself, but the whole thing with Prop 19, at least as it stands today, is if I own a rental property and I pass and I want to pass it on to my child can inherit that rental property provided they live in that property. They will keep the tax basis. But the moment my child says, no, I want to use it as a rental property because I live out in New York, but I want to keep the house here and I want to rent it, their tax basis gets reassessed at the time of death. And so what we were finding is a lot of people that have second homes, they have the vacation home up in Big Bear, they have the property in Balboa, things like that, that's gonna be a problem now for them to pass on that property that has been in the family for generations, because maybe they bought that Balboa home at 500,000 and now it's worth 5 million and they've passed it on. So that's, right, so that's where you see a lot of these, like, people would come in, and if they took, now if the property is held in the name of an LLC, it's not subject to the Prop 19. So
I've seen Prop 19 hit, when the last trustee of a living trust passes away, and it passes to the successor trustee. Prop 19 hits that successor trustee in the trust.
right.
I've
Right.
helped trust sell 6 properties this year where that happened. And the, you know, $2,000 a year property taxes now became $15,000 a year. Plus, not only got hit on that, but then there was the supplemental tax bill catch up. A lot of money, you know,
Right.
caused a lot of pain.
So yeah, exactly what you're saying. And it's unfortunate because I think the intent of Prop 19 was to free up more housing so more things would hit the market. But it's unfortunate for a lot of investors and people who want to create generational wealth through real estate, because it's now hitting their pocketbook. And a lot of it, unfortunately, was passed during the COVID 2020-21. So it kind of, people felt like it was pulling the wool over their eyes. No one really knew what was happening. And before they knew, it passed. And it was just, you know, and there have been changes to it. The hope is it'll continue to change and evolve. I mean, at one point it was, you could only keep the tax basis if all the children lived in the house, and then that seemed kind of crazy to have like adult children and all their families. So now it's been modified to, I believe, if one child makes it their primary residence, and meaning it has to really be their primary residence, you know. So like we had a client and they had a place up in Big Bear, they wanted to keep it. Well, the child had to move there and file tax. Everything has to be from there. It's not just, oh, I go up there a few days a week and I get my mail there. So they really are checking that to keep that tax, you know, the tax assessor is finding any way to try to get their money, you know.
Can the children switch off on that? So let's say one moves in and lives there for 10 years and then they said they want to move out, can the other child move in?
I think the catch with the two is, I don't know, and I don't know the exact timing on it. I think they either have to live in the property continuously, the one child, for 2 years to keep that tax basis.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, if they wanted to sell it or whatever, they could, but they've kept that basis. So yeah, so.
Keeping the tax basis, you mean not the step-up value?
Yeah, step up is different. So that's a question that, like, that's another question when you have someone in the office. It's asking them what do they really want with what is the goal of the family, right? Because a lot of
it's
times
all about goals.
parents have, I see nowadays, and I'm sure we all see investors that are now in their 70s and 80s, and their goal was to create this cash flow in the stream, but the kids don't see it that way. The kids don't want to manage property, they have no interest. So if we're sitting down and we're looking at business succession and that sort of stuff, what are the goals? Because maybe mom and dad's goal is we want to pass on this portfolio to you, and the kids say, oh, I don't want a headache, I don't want. So then maybe it's better off, to just wait till mom and dad die and the kids get the stuff up in basis and they just sell everything and liquidate it, because at least they're not paying tax on it, right? So some of that, you have to kind of see that. The worst thing you could possibly do, which I see people do, is if nothing else, do not put title of another child or something on your property, because that's the biggest thing people do, and it reassesses your tax basis. So that's the other thing, Mom's worried she's getting old and she puts the daughter on her deed, right, and puts it on title. Now the assessor sees that as a transfer, and your tax basis is going to go up. So that's why a lot of this stuff I feel like has to be discussed with an attorney, or people don't know. They just do something out of fear, and then they realize later on, oh great, I bought that house in 1970 for $70,000 and now I'm paying $1 million tax basis.
I thought a transfer from parent to child or parent to grandchildren was tax exempt.
$1.
Prop 19.
Prop 19 changed it.
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah. Prop
Yeah.
19 killed it.
Prop 19 is a whole different, and so that's what I'm saying, people don't know a lot of that stuff. So it's really important to sit down and talk to somebody, because people think, oh, that's an exemption or this is not, and a lot of times they don't know, they do something unknowingly, and it creates a problem in the situation. So
Yeah, Prop 19, the big lie.
so yeah, it's unfortunate. Hopefully things will change, but
Well, thanks, Shilpa.
yeah, no problem, guys.